The Book of Werewolves is a comprehensive study of the werewolf phenomenon, written by Sabine Baring-Gould and first published in 1865. This book explores the belief in werewolves as it appears in European folklore and mythology, tracing its origins back through classical antiquity and medieval times. Baring-Gould provides an in-depth examination of the werewolf legend, using examples from ancient literature, folk tales, and historical accounts. He delves into the psychological, mythological, and cultural explanations for this widespread belief, offering insights into how and why such superstitions persisted for centuries. As one of the earliest scholarly works on werewolves, the Book of Werewolves remains a significant resource for those interested in folklore, supernatural creatures, and the intersection between myth and reality. Whether you are fascinated by the history of the werewolf or curious about the evolution of myths, this book offers a thorough exploration of a haunting and mysterious subject. Chapter 1. Introductory. I shall never forget the walk I took one night in Vienne after having accomplished the examination of an unknown druidical relic, the Pierre l'Abbé, at La Rondelle, near Champigny. I had learned of the existence of this cromlech only on my arrival at Champigny in the afternoon, and I'd started to visit the curiosity without calculating the time it would take me to reach it and to return. Suffice it to say that I discovered the venerable pile of grey stones as the sun set, and I expended the last lights of evening in planning and sketching. I then turned my face homeward. My walk of about 10 miles had wearied me, coming at the end of a long day's posting, and I had lamed myself in scrambling over some stones to the Gaulish relic. A small hamlet was at no great distance, and I betook myself thither in the hopes of hiring a trap to convey me to the post-house, but I was disappointed. Few in the place could speak French, and the priest, when I applied to him, assured me that he believed there was no better conveyance in the place than a common charrue with its solid wooden wheels. Nor was a riding horse to be procured. The good man offered to house me for the night, but I was obliged to decline, as my family intended, starting early on the following morning. Outspake then the mayor, "Monsieur can never go back tonight across the flats because of the and his voice dropped, the loup-garou. "He says that he must return," replied the priest in patois, "but who will go with him?" "Aha, Monsieur le Curé, it is all very well for one of us to accompany him, but think of the coming back alone." "Then two must go with him," said the priest, "and you can take care of each other as you return." "Picou tells me that he saw the werewolf only this day se'nnight," said a peasant. "He was down by the hedge of his buckwheat field, and the sun had set, and he was thinking of coming home when he heard a rustle on the far side of the hedge. He looked over, and there stood the wolf as big as a calf against the horizon, its tongue out, and its eyes glaring like marsh fires. Mon Dieu, catch me going over the Marais tonight. Why, what could two men do if they were attacked by that wolf-fiend?" "It is tempting Providence," said one of the elders of the village. "No man must expect the help of God if he throws himself wilfully in the way of danger. Is it not so, Monsieur le Curé? I heard you say as much from the pulpit on the first Sunday in Lent, preaching from the Gospel." "That is true," observed several, shaking their heads. "His tongue hanging out and his eyes glaring like marsh fires," said the confidant of Picou. "Mon Dieu, if I met the monster I should run," quoth another. "I quite believe you, Cortres, I can answer for it that you would," said the mayor. "As big as a calf," threw in Picou's friend. "If the loup-garou were only a natural wolf, why then, you see." The mayor cleared his throat. "You see, we should think nothing of it. But, Monsieur le Curé, it is a fiend, a worse than fiend, a man-fiend, a worse than man-fiend, a man-wolf fiend." "But what is the young monsieur to do?" asked the priest, looking from one to another. "Never mind," said I, who had been quietly listening to their patois, which I understood. "Never mind, I will walk back by myself, and if I meet the loup-garou I will crop his ears and tail and send them to Monsieur le Maire with my compliments." A sigh of relief from the assembly as they found themselves clear of the difficulty. "Il est anglais," said the mayor, shaking his head as though he meant that an Englishman might face the devil with impunity. A melancholy flat was the Marais, looking desolate enough by day, but now, in the gloaming, tenfold as desolate. The sky was perfectly clear and of a soft blue-grey tinge, illumined by the new moon, a curve of light approaching its western bed. To the horizon reached a fen, blacked with pools of stagnant water, from which the frogs kept up an incessant trill through the summer night. Heath and fern covered the ground, but near the water grew dense masses of flag and bulrush, amongst which the light wind sighed wearily. Here and there stood a sandy knoll capped with firs, looking like black splashes against the grey sky. Not a sign of habitation anywhere, the only trace of men being the white, straight road extending for miles across the fen. That this district harboured wolves is not improbable, and I confess that I armed myself with a strong stick at the first clump of trees through which the road dived. This was my first introduction to werewolves, and the circumstance of finding the superstition still so prevalent first gave me the idea of investigating the history and the habits of these mythical creatures. And I must acknowledge that I have been quite unsuccessful in obtaining a specimen of the animal, but I have found its traces in all directions, and just as the paleontologist has constructed the labyrinthodon out of its footprints in marl, and one splinter of bone, so may this monograph be complete and accurate, although I have no chained werewolf before me, which I may sketch and describe from the life. The traces left are indeed numerous enough, and though perhaps like the dodo or the dinormis, the werewolf may have become extinct in our age, yet he has left his stamp on classic antiquity. He has trodden deep in northern snows, has ridden roughshod over the medievals, and has howled amongst oriental sepulchres. He belonged to a bad breed, and we are quite content to be freed from him and his kindred, the vampire and the ghoul. Yet who knows? We may be a little too hasty in concluding that he is extinct. He may still prowl in Abyssinian forests, range still over Asiatic steppes, and be found howling dismally in some padded room of a Hanwell or a Bedlam. In the following pages I design to investigate the notices of werewolves to be found in the ancient writers of classic antiquity, those contained in the northern sagas, and, lastly, the numerous details afforded by the medieval authors. In connection with this, I shall give a sketch of modern folklore relating to lycanthropy. It will then be seen that under the veil of mythology lies a solid reality, that a floating superstition holds in solution a positive truth. This I shall show to be an innate craving for blood implanted in certain natures, restrained under ordinary circumstances, but breaking forth occasionally, accompanied with hallucination, leading in most cases to cannibalism. I shall then give instances of persons thus afflicted, who were believed by others and who believed themselves, to be transformed into beasts, and who, in the paroxysms of their madness, committed numerous murders and devoured their victims. I shall next give instances of persons suffering from the same passion for blood, who murdered for the mere gratification of their natural cruelty, but who were not subject to hallucinations, nor were addicted to cannibalism. I shall also give instances of persons filled with the same propensities, who murdered and ate their victims, but who were perfectly free from hallucination. Chapter 2. Lycanthropy among the Ancients. What is lycanthropy? The change of man or woman into the form of a wolf, either through magical means, so as to enable him or her to gratify the taste for human flesh, or through judgment of the gods in punishment for some great offence. This is the popular definition. Truly it consists in a form of madness, such as may be found in most asylums. Among the ancients, this kind of insanity went by the names of lycanthropy, quanthropy, or boanthropy, because those afflicted with it believed themselves to be turned into wolves, dogs, or cows. But in the north of Europe, as we shall see, the shape of a bear, and in Africa that of a hyena, were often selected in preference. A mere matter of taste. According to Marcellus Sidetes, of whose poem Perilycanthropou a fragment exists, men are attacked with this madness chiefly in the beginning of the year, and become most furious in February, retiring for the night to lone cemeteries, and living precisely in the manner of dogs and wolves. Virgil writes in his 8th Eclogue, Has herbas atque hec ponto mihi lecta venena ipse dedit meris, nascuntur plurima ponto. His ego sepe lupum fieri et se conducere silvis merim, sepe animas imis excire sepulchris, atque satas alio, vidi traducere messes. And Herodotus, It seems that the Nuri are sorcerers, if one is to believe the Scythians and the Greeks established in Scythia. For each Nurian changes himself once in the year into the form of a wolf, and he continues in that form for several days, after which he resumes his former shape. Libro 405. See also Pomponius Mela, Libro secondo capitolo 1. There is a fixed time for each Nurian, at which they change, if they like, into wolves, and back again into their former condition. But the most remarkable story among the ancients is that related by Ovid in his Metamorphoses of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, who, entertaining Jupiter one day, set before him a hash of human flesh to prove his omniscience, whereupon the god transferred him into a wolf. In vain he attempted to speak. From that very instant his jaws were bespluttered with foam, and only he thirsted for blood, as he raged amongst flocks and panted for slaughter. His vesture was changed into hair, his limbs became crooked. A wolf he retains yet large trace of his ancient expression. Hoary he is as afore, his countenance rabid, his eyes glitter savagely still, the picture of fury. Pliny relates from Evanthes that on the festival of Jupiter Lycaeus, one of the family of Antaeus was selected by lot and conducted to the brink of the Arcadian lake. He then hung his clothes on a tree and plunged into the water, whereupon he was transformed into a wolf. 9 years after, if he had not tasted human flesh, he was at liberty to swim back and resume his former shape, which had in the meantime become aged as though he had worn it for 9 years. Agriopas relates that Demenetus, having assisted at an Arcadian human sacrifice to Jupiter Lycaeus, ate of the flesh, and was at once transformed into a wolf, in which shape he prowled about for 10 years, after which he recovered his human form and took part in the Olympic Games. The following story is from Petronius. My master had gone to Capua to sell some old clothes. I seized the opportunity and persuaded our guest to bear me company about 5 miles out of town, for he was a soldier, and as bold as death. We set out about cockcrow, and the moon shone bright as day, when coming among some monuments, my man began to converse with the stars, whilst I jogged along singing and counting them. Presently I looked back after him and saw him strip and lay his clothes by the side of the road. My heart was in my mouth in an instant. I stood like a corpse, when in a crack he was turned into a wolf. Don't think I'm joking. I would not tell you a lie for the finest fortune in the world. But to continue, after he was turned into a wolf, he set up a howl and made straight for the woods. At first I did not know whether I was on my head or my heels, but at last going to take up his clothes I found them turned into stone. The sweat streamed from me, and I never expected to get over it. Melissa began to wonder why I walked so late. "Had you come a little sooner," she said, "you might at least have lent us a hand. For a wolf broke into the farm and has butchered all our cattle, but though he got off, it was no laughing matter for him, for a servant of ours ran him through with a pike. Hearing this, I could not close an eye, but as soon as it was daylight I ran home like a peddler that has been eased of his pack. Coming to the place where the clothes had been turned into stone, I saw nothing but a pool of blood, and when I got home I found my soldier lying in bed like an ox in a stall and a surgeon dressing his neck. I saw at once that he was a fellow who could change his skin versipellis, and never after could I eat bread with him, no, not if you would have killed me. Those who would have taken a different view of the case are welcome to their opinion. If I tell you a lie, may your genii confound me. As everyone knows, Jupiter changed himself into a bull, Hecuba became a bitch, Actaeon a stag, the comrades of Ulysses were transformed into swine, and the daughters of Protus fled through the fields believing themselves to be cows, and would not allow anyone to come near them, lest they should be caught and yoked. St. Augustine declared in his De Civitate Dei that he knew an old woman who was said to turn men into asses by her enchantments. Apuleius has left us his charming romance of the Golden Ass, in which the hero, through injudicious use of a magical salve, is transformed into that long-eared animal. It is to be observed that the chief seat of lycanthropy was Arcadia, and it has been very plausibly suggested that the cause might be traced to the following circumstance. The natives were a pastoral people, and would consequently suffer very severely from the attacks and depredations of wolves. They would naturally institute a sacrifice to obtain deliverance from this pest, and security for their flocks. This sacrifice consisted in the offering of a child, and it was instituted by Lycaon. From the circumstance of the sacrifice being human, and from the peculiarity of the name of its originator, rose the myth. But on the other hand, the story is far too widely spread for us to attribute it to an accidental origin, or to trace it to a local source. Half the world believes or believed in were wolves, and they were supposed to haunt the Norwegian forests by those who had never remotely been connected with Arcadia. And the superstition had probably struck deep its roots into the Scandinavian and Teutonic minds, ages before Lycaon existed, and we have only to glance at Oriental literature to see it as firmly engrafted in the imagination of the Easterns. Chapter 3. The Werewolf in the North. In Norway and Iceland, certain men were said to be eigi einhamir, not of one skin, an idea which had its roots in paganism. The full form of this strange superstition was that men could take upon them other bodies, and the natures of those beings whose bodies they assumed. The second adopted shape was called by the same name as the original shape, hammer, and the expression made use of to designate the transition from one body to another was at skipta humum or at hammaz, whilst the expedition made in the second form was the hamfer. By this transfiguration, extraordinary powers were acquired. The natural strength of the individual was doubled or quadrupled. He acquired the strength of the beast in whose body he travelled, in addition to his own, and a man thus invigorated was called hamrammer. The manner in which the change was effected varied. At times a dress of skin was cast over the body, and at once the transformation was complete. At others the human body was deserted, and the soul entered the second form, leaving the first body in a cataleptic state to all appearance dead. The second hammer was either borrowed or created for the purpose. There was yet a third manner of producing this effect. It was by incantation. But then the form of the individual remained unaltered, though the eyes of all beholders were charmed so that they could only perceive him under the selected form. Having assumed some bestial shape, the man who is eigi einhammer is only to be recognized by his eyes, which by no power can be changed. He then pursues his course, follows the instincts of the beast whose body he has taken, yet without quenching his own intelligence. He is able to do what the body of the animal can do, and do what he, as man, can do as well. He may fly or swim if he is in the shape of bird or fish. If he has taken the form of a wolf, or if he goes on a gandrid or wolf's ride, he is full of the rage and malignity of the creatures whose powers and passions he has assumed. I will give a few instances of each of the three methods of changing bodies mentioned above. Freya and Frigg had their falcon dresses, in which they visited different regions of the earth, and Loki is said to have borrowed these and to have then appeared so precisely like a falcon that he would have escaped detection but for the malicious twinkle of his eyes. In the Velundar Kvida is the following passage: Mejar flugusunnan myrkvid I gögnum, alvitr unga, och lögdryga terrasavarströn settusk att vilask de drosirsudränar, dirtlin spunnu. Ein nam teira, egil att verja, fugr mer fira, fad miljosum. Önnur var svanvitt svanfjadrar drå, en intridja teira systir. Var I hvitan, hals Völundar. From the south flew the maidens, athwart the gloom and alvit the young to fix destinies, they on the sea strand sat them to rest, these damsels of the south. Fair linen spun, one of them took eagle to press a fair maid in her dazzling arms. Another was Svanwit who wore swan feathers, and the third that their sister pressed the white neck of Veland. The introduction of Sermund tells us that these charming young ladies were caught when they had laid their swanskins beside them on the shore, and were consequently not in a condition to fly. In like manner were wolves' dresses used. The following curious passage is from the wild saga of the Völsungs. It is now to be told that Sigmund thought Sinfjotli too young to help him in his revenge, and he wished first to test his powers. So during the summer they plunged deep into the wood and slew men for their goods, and Sigmund saw that he was quite of the Völsung stock. Now it fell out that as they went through the forest collecting moneys, that they lighted on a house in which were two men sleeping, with great gold rings on them. They had dealings with witchcraft, for wolfskins hung up in the house above them. It was the 10th day on which they might come out of their second state. They were king's sons. Sigmund and Sinfjotli got into the habits, and could not get out of them again, and the nature of the original beasts came over them, and they howled as wolves. They learned both of them to howl. Now they went into the forest, and each took his own course. They made the agreement together that they should try their strength against as many as 7 men, but not more, and that he who was aware of strife should utter his wolf's howl. Do not fail in this, said Sigmund, for you are young and daring, and men would be glad to chase you. Now each went his own course, and after that they had parted. Sigmund found men, so he howled. And when Sinfjotli heard that, he ran up and slew them all. Then they separated. And Sinfjotli had not been long in the wood before he met with 11 men. He fell upon them and slew them every one. Then he was tired, so he flung himself under an oak to rest. Up came Sigmund and said, "Why did you not call out?" Sinfjotli replied, "What was the need of asking your help to kill 11 men?" Sigmund flew at him and rent him so that he fell, for he had bitten through his throat. That day they could not leave their wolf forms. Sigmund laid him on his back and bare him home to the hall, and sat beside him and said, "Deuce take the wolf forms." Volsung Saga C8. There is another curious story of a werewolf in the same saga which I must relate. Now he did as she requested, and hewed down a great piece of timber and cast it across the feet of those 10 brothers seated in a row in the forest. And there they sat all that day and on till night. And at midnight there came an old she-wolf out of the forest to them, as they sat in the stocks, and she was both huge and grimly. Now she fell upon one of them and bit him to death, and after she had eaten him all up, she went away. And next morning Signy sent a trusty man to her brothers to know how it had fared with them. When he returned, he told her of the death of one, and that grieved her much, for she feared it might fare thus with them all, and she would be unable to assist them. In short, 9 nights following came the same she-wolf at midnight, and devoured them one after another till all were dead, except Sigmund, and he was left alone. So when the 10th night came, Signy sent her trusty man to Sigmund, her brother, with honey in his hand, and said that he was to smear it over the face of Sigmund, and to fill his mouth with it. Now he went to Sigmund, and did as he was bid, after which he returned home. And during the night came the same she-wolf, as was her wont, and reckoned to devour him, like his brothers. Now she snuffed at him, where the honey was smeared, and began to lick his face with her tongue, and presently thrust her tongue into his mouth. He bore it ill, and bit into the tongue of the she-wolf. She sprang up and tried to break loose, setting her feet against the stock so as to snap it asunder, but he held firm, and ripped the tongue out by the roots, so that it was the death of the wolf. It is the opinion of some men that this beast was the mother of King Siggeir, and that she had taken this form upon her through devilry and witchcraft. C5. There is another story bearing on the subject in the Hrolf Saga Kraka, which is pretty. It is as follows. In the north of Norway, in upland dales, reigned a king called Hring, and he had a son named Björn. Now it fell out that the queen died, much lamented by the king and by all. The people advised him to marry again, and so he sent men south to get him a wife. A gale and fierce storm fell upon them, so that they had to turn the helm and run before the wind, and so they came north to Finnmark, where they spent the winter. One day they went inland and came to a house in which sat 2 beautiful women, who greeted them well, and inquired whence they had come. They replied by giving an account of their journey and their errand, and then asked the women who they were and why they were alone and far from the haunts of men, although they were so comely and engaging. The elder replied that her name was Ingebjorg, and that her daughter was called Havit, and that she was the Finn king's sweetheart. The messengers decided that they would choose the younger one, and then all at once they found that she was a werewolf. Chapter 4. The Origin of the Scandinavian Werewolf. One of the great advantages of the study of Old Norse or Icelandic literature is the insight given by it into the origin of worldwide superstitions. Norse tradition is transparent as glacier ice, and its origin is as unmistakable. Medieval mythology, rich and gorgeous, is a compound like Corinthian brass, into which many pure ores have been fused, or it is a full turbid river drawn from numerous feeders, which had their sources in remote climes. It is a blending of primeval Celtic, Teutonic, Scandinavian, Italic and Arab traditions, each adding a beauty, each yielding a charm, but each accretion rendering the analysis more difficult. Paciuchelli says, "The Anio flows into the Tiber. Pure as crystal it meets the tawny stream, and is lost in it, so that there is no more Anio, but the united stream is all Tiber. So is it with each tributary to the tide of medieval mythology. The moment it has blended its waters with the great and onward-rolling flood, it is impossible to detect it with certainty. It has swollen the stream, but has lost its own identity. If we would analyze a particular myth, we must not go at once to the body of medieval superstition, but strike at one of the tributaries before its absorption. This we shall proceed to do, and in selecting Norse mythology, we come upon abundant material, pointing naturally to the spot whence it has been derived, as glacial moraines indicate the direction which they have taken, and point to the mountains whence they have fallen. It will not be difficult for us to arrive at the origin of the northern belief in werewolves, and the data thus obtained will be useful in assisting us to elucidate much that would otherwise prove obscure in medieval tradition. Among the Old Norse, it was the custom for certain warriors to dress in the skins of the beasts they had slain, and thus to give themselves an air of ferocity, calculated to strike terror into the hearts of their foes. Such dresses are mentioned in some sagas, without there being any supernatural qualities attached to them. For instance, in the Njala there is mention of a man, Egethedni, in goatskin dress. Much in the same way do we hear of Harald Harfager having in his company a band of berserker, who were all dressed in wolf-skins, Ulfhednir, and this expression, wolf-skin-coated, is met with as a man's name. Thus in the Holmverja saga there is mention of a Björn, son of Ulfhedin, wolf-skin coat, son of Ulfhammer, wolf-shaped, son of Ulf, son of Ulfhammer, wolf-shaped, who could change forms. But the most conclusive passage is in the Vatnsdæla saga, and is as follows. Those berserkir who were called Ulfhednir had got wolfskins over their male coats. See sexes. In like manner, the word berserker, used of a man possessed of superhuman powers and subject to accesses of diabolical fury, was originally applied to one of those doughty champions who went about in bear sarks, or habits made of bear skin over their armour. I am well aware that Björn Haldorsson's derivation of berserker, bare of sark, or destitute of clothing, has been hitherto generally received, but Sveinbjörn Egilsson, an indisputable authority, rejects this derivation as untenable and substitutes for it that which I have adopted. It may be well imagined that a wolf or a bearskin would make a warm and comfortable greatcoat to a man whose manner of living required him to defy all weathers, and that the dress would not only give him an appearance of grimness and ferocity, likely to produce an unpleasant emotion in the breast of a foe, but also that the thick fur might prove effectual in deadening the blows rained on him in conflict. The berserker was an object of aversion and terror to the peaceful inhabitants of the land, his avocation being to challenge quiet country farmers to single combat. As the law of the land stood in Norway, a man who declined to accept a challenge forfeited all his possessions, even to the wife of his bosom, as a poltroon unworthy of the protection of the law, and every item of his property passed into the hands of his challenger. The berserker accordingly had the unhappy man at his mercy. If he slew him, the farmer's possessions became his, and if the poor fellow declined to fight, he lost all legal right to his inheritance. A berserker would invite himself to any feast, and contribute his quota to the hilarity of the entertainment, by snapping the backbone or cleaving the skull of some merrymaker who incurred his displeasure, or whom he might single out to murder, for no other reason than a desire to keep his hand in practice. It may well be imagined that popular superstition went along with the popular dread of these wolf and bear-skinned rovers, and that they were believed to be endued with the force, as they certainly were with the ferocity, of the beasts whose skins they wore. Nor would superstition stop there, but the imagination of the trembling peasants would speedily invest these unscrupulous disturbers of the public peace with the attributes hitherto appropriated to trolls and jötuns. The incident mentioned in the Völsung saga of the sleeping men being found with their wolfskins hanging to the wall above their heads is divested of its improbability if we regard these skins as worn over their armour, and the marvellous in the whole story is reduced to a minimum when we suppose that Sigmund and Sinfjotli stole these for the purpose of disguising themselves, whilst they lived a life of violence and robbery. In a similar manner, the story of the northern Beauty and Beast, in Hrolf's Saga Kraka, is rendered less improbable, on the supposition that Björn was living as an outlaw among the mountain fastnesses in a bearskin dress, which would effectually disguise him, all but his eyes, which would gleam out of the sockets in his hideous visor, unmistakably human. His very name, Björn, signifies a bear, and these two circumstances may well have invested a kernel of historic fact with all the romance of fable. And if divested of these supernatural embellishments, the story would resolve itself into the very simple fact of there having been a King Hring of the Updales, who was at variance with his son, and whose son took to the woods and lived a berserker life in company with his mistress, till he was captured and slain by his father. I think that the circumstance insisted on by the saga writers of the eyes of the person remaining unchanged is very significant and points to the fact that the skin was merely drawn over the body as a disguise. But there was other ground for superstition to fasten on the berserker and invest them with supernatural attributes. No fact in connection with the history of the Northmen is more firmly established on reliable evidence than that of the berserker rage being a species of diabolical possession. The berserker were said to work themselves up into a state of frenzy in which a demoniacal power came over them, impelling them to acts from which in their sober senses they would have recoiled. They acquired superhuman force and were as invulnerable and as insensible to pain as the Jansenist convulsionists of Esmedard. No sword would wound them, no fire would burn them, a club alone could destroy them, by breaking their bones or crushing in their skulls. Their eyes glared as though a flame burned in the sockets. They ground their teeth and frothed at the mouth. They gnawed at their shield rims and are said to have sometimes bitten them through, and as they rushed into conflict, they yelped as dogs or howled as wolves. According to the unanimous testimony of the Old Norse historians, the berserker rage was extinguished by baptism, and as Christianity advanced, the number of these berserker decreased. But it must not be supposed that this madness or possession came only on those persons who predisposed themselves to be attacked by it. Others were afflicted with it, who vainly struggled against its influence and who deeply lamented their own liability to be seized with these terrible accesses of frenzy. Such was Thorir Ingimund's son, of whom it is said in the Vatnsdæla saga that, at times there came over Thorir berserker fits, and it was considered a sad misfortune to such a man as they were quite beyond control. The manner in which he was cured is remarkable, pointing as it does to the craving in the heathen mind for a better and more merciful creed. Thorgrim of Kornsar had a child by his concubine Vereida, and by order of his wife the child was carried out to perish. The brothers Thorstein and Thorir often met, and it was now the turn of Thorstein to visit Thorir, and Thorir accompanied him homeward. On their way, Thorstein asked Thorir which he thought was the first among the brethren. Thorir answered that the reply was easy, "For you are above us all in discretion and talent. Jökull is the best in all perilous adventures. But I," he added, "I am the least worth of us brothers, because the berserker fits come over me quite against my will, and I wish that you, my brother, with your shrewdness, would devise some help for me." Thorstein said, "I have heard that our kinsman Thorgrim has just suffered his little babe to be carried out at the instigation of his wife. That is ill done. I think also that it is a grievous matter for you to be different in nature from other men." Thorir asked how he could obtain release from his affliction. Then said Thorstein, "Now will I make a vow to him who created the sun, for I ween that he is most able to take the ban of you, and I will undertake for his sake in return to rescue the babe and to bring it up for him, till he who created man shall take it to himself. For this I reckon he will do." After this they left their horses and sought the child, and a thrall of Thorir had found it near the Marram River. They saw that a kerchief had been spread over its face, but it had rumpled it up over its nose. The little thing was all but dead, but they took it up and flitted it home to Thorir's house, and he brought the lad up and called him Thorkel Rumpel. As for the berserker fits, they came on him no more. But the most remarkable passages bearing on our subject will be found in the Igla. There was a man, Ulf, the wolf by name, son of Bjalfi and Halbera. Ulf was a man so tall and strong that the like of him was not to be seen in the land at that time, and when he was young he was out Viking expeditions and harrying. He was a great landed proprietor. It was his wont to rise early and to go about the men's work or to the smithies and inspect all his goods and his acres, and sometimes he talked with those men who wanted his advice. For he was a good adviser, he was so clear-headed. However, every day when it drew towards dusk, he became so savage that few dared exchange a word with him, for he was given to dozing in the afternoon. People said that he was much given to changing form, Hamramr, so he was called the Evening Wolf, Kveldulfur, Ki. 1. In this and the following passages, I do not consider Hamramr to have its primary signification of actual transformation, but simply to mean subject to fits of diabolical possession, under the influence of which the bodily powers were greatly exaggerated. I shall translate pretty freely from this most interesting saga, as I consider that the description given in it of Kveldulf in his fits greatly elucidates our subject. Kveldulf and Skallagrim got news during summer of an expedition. Skallagrim was the keenest-sighted of men, and he caught sight of the vessel of Halvard and his brother, and recognized it at once. He followed their course and marked the haven into which they entered at even. Then he returned to his company and told Kveldulf of what he had seen. Then they busked them and got ready both their boats. In each they put 20 men, Kveldulf steering one and Skallagrim the other, and they rowed in quest of the ship. Now, when they came to the place where it was, they lay to. Halvard and his men had spread an awning over the deck and were asleep. Now, when Kveldulf and his party came upon them, the watchers who were seated at the end of the bridge sprang up and called to the people on board to wake up, for there was danger in the wind. So Halvard and his men sprang to arms. Then came Kveldulf over the bridge and Skallagrim with him into the ship. Kveldulf had in his hand a cleaver, and he bade his men go through the vessel and hack away the awning. But he pressed on to the quarterdeck. It is said the werewolf fit came over him and many of his companions. They slew all the men who were before them. Skallagrim did the same as he went round the vessel. He and his father paused not till they had cleared it. Now when Kveldulf came upon the quarterdeck, he raised his cleaver and smote Halvard through helm and head, so that the haft was buried in the flesh. But he dragged it to him so violently that he whisked Halvard into the air and flung him overboard. Skallagrim cleared the forecastle and slew Sigtryg. Many men flung themselves overboard, but Skallagrim's men took to the boat and rowed about, killing all they found. Thus perished Halvard with 50 men. Skallagrim and his party took the ship and all the goods which had belonged to Halvard, and flitted it and the wares to their own vessel, and then exchanged ships, lading their capture, but quitting their own. After which they filled their old ship with stones, brake it up, and sank it. A good breeze sprang up, and they stood out to sea. It is said of these men in the engagement who were werewolves, or those on whom came the berserker rage, that as long as the fit was on them no one could oppose them, they were so strong. But when it had passed off they were feebler than usual. It was the same with Kveldulf when the werewolf fit went off him. He then felt the exhaustion consequent on the fight, and he was so completely done up that he was obliged to take to his bed. In like manner Skallagrim had his fits of frenzy, taking after his amiable father. Thord and his companion were opposed to Skallagrim in the game, and they were too much for him, he wearied, and the game went better with them. But at dusk, after sunset, it went worse with Egil and Thord. For Skallagrim became so strong that he caught up Thord and cast him down, so that he broke his bones, and that was the death of him. Then he caught at Egil. Thorgerd Brak was the name of a servant of Skallagrim, who had been foster mother to Egil. She was a woman of great stature, strong as a man, and a bit of a witch. Brak exclaimed, "Skallagrim, are you now falling upon your son? Hamaz thu at sini thinum." Then Skallagrim let go his hold of Egil and clutched at her. She started aside and fled. Skallagrim followed. They ran out upon Digraness, and she sprang off the headland into the water. Skallagrim cast after her a huge stone which struck her between the shoulders, and she never rose after it. The place is now called Brak's Sound, c. 40. Let it be observed that in these passages from the Eglah the words ad Hamaz, Hamrama, etc. are used without any intention of conveying the idea of a change of bodily shape, though the words taken literally assert it, for they are derived from hammer, a skin or habit, a word which has its representatives in other Aryan languages and is therefore a primitive word expressive of the skin of a beast. The Sanskrit chama, the Hindustani kam, hide or skin, and kamra, leather. The Persian gamma, clothing, disguise, the Gothic ham or ham, skin, and even the Italian camicia and the French chemise are cognate words. It seems probable, accordingly, that the verb ad hamaz was first applied to those who wore the skins of savage animals and went about the country as freebooters, but that popular superstition soon invested them with supernatural powers, and they were supposed to assume the forms of the beasts in whose skins they were disguised. The verb then acquired the significance to become a werewolf, to change shape. It did not stop there, but went through another change of meaning, and was finally applied to those who were afflicted with paroxysms of madness or diabolical possession. This was not the only word connected with werewolves which helped on the superstition. The word varga, a wolf, had a double significance, which would be the means of originating many a werewolf story. Vaga is the same as uaga, restless, aga being the same as the Anglo-Saxon erg. Vaga had its double signification in Norse. It signified a wolf and also a godless man. This vaga is the English word in the word werewolf, and the garu or varu in French. The Danish word for werewolf is varulf, the Gothic vairaulf. In the Romans dagarin, it is le waru, sanglante beste. Thus in the Norse vaga means a wild beast and a godless man. In the Anglo-Saxon were means man. The Anglo-Saxon vergan and the German worgen signify to curse because the godless man was under a curse. The transition from calling a notorious evildoer a wolf to regarding him as a werewolf is easy. This transition was further facilitated by a law in the Code of the Franks and the Code of the Burgundians, which condemned great criminals to become pariahs, to be driven into the forest with their heads shaved, and there, without the privilege of taking shelter under a roof or partaking of the rites of the church, to live like wild beasts, preying on the flocks, till someone was found courageous enough to hunt them down and kill them. Chapter 5. The Werewolf in the Middle Ages. The werewolf superstition, which existed in Greece and Rome, found its way to the north, and through Teutonic mythology permeated the whole of Western Europe during the Middle Ages. That this was the case is evident from the legal enactments against the horrible crimes perpetrated by these supposed wolves in human form, as well as from the numerous stories which have come down to us relating to lycanthropy. As early as the year 1020, there is mention of this superstition in the ecclesiastical ordinances of the Church of Rouen. The concubinage of priests, says Archbishop Richard, produces children, who by an extraordinary superstition are devoted to the devil and become garulfi, which means that they are turned into wolves at certain times and are ferocious, as wolves are. In the year 1150, David de Menevia, Archbishop of St. David's, Wales, writes, "Certain Welshmen living near the mountains of the Cantred of the Eerie said that some of their countrymen, by a means unknown to them, had been changed into wolves, who left the forest and wandered among their fellow countrymen to satisfy their ravenous hunger. In the Gesta Romanorum is an account of a priest who went out with some of his parishioners to hunt wolves, and who, while pursuing the chase, saw a wolf gnawing the dead body of a man. He raised his cross and exorcised the wolf, which at once fled, leaving its prey. The priest immediately mounted the lifeless body of the man on his horse and brought it to the church to be buried. The abbot Majolus, in his De Miraculis es Benedicti, mentions that in 970 a villager near Paris was changed into a wolf. He is said to have assumed the form and ferocity of the beast, but to have retained the voice of a man. He was discovered in a state of madness, biting the flesh of dead animals and men. S. Patrick, when in Wales, found that a certain man had the power of turning into a wolf. This man came to the saint with a request that he might never be seen in his wolf form. The good S. Patrick prayed for him and obtained his desire. Several instances of a similar superstition are related in the Irish legends, and it is remarkable that the majority of the medieval werewolves are represented as retaining their human voice, which is not the case in Teutonic or Scandinavian tradition. In fact, Irish superstition has peculiar features of its own, and these are worth a brief consideration. In some places, when a wolf was caught, it was customary to perform a ceremony before killing it, which was believed to restore it to human form. The form of exorcism was very solemn and serious. A curious account of such a ceremony is found in Giraldus Cambrensis's Topographia Hibernica, where he relates that the inhabitants of Ossory were accustomed to be turned into wolves, and that, when they were captured, they were brought to the priest, who exorcised them, and immediately restored them to their human forms. This superstition continued down to the time of Giraldus, and no doubt later. It is important to bear in mind that the origin of lycanthropy in the British Isles is independent of Teutonic tradition, for the Teutonic nations did not bring the belief with them into England, though they undoubtedly brought it into Germany, France, and Italy. In England, the werewolf is exclusively Celtic, and in Wales it is connected with the traditions of Cylydon Wledig, who was known as the King of Wolves. The Scottish Highlanders believed in men who were changed into wolves by means of magic, and who were able to retain their human shape at will. In the Orkneys there was a belief in a similar superstition, but the name given to such a being was Wulva, and he was supposed to inhabit a particular island, where he fed on fish and occasionally paid visits to the mainland to carry off sheep. In France, the werewolf superstition prevailed to a great extent during the Middle Ages, and the stories connected with it form a large part of the popular legends of the country. But it was in the 16th century that this belief reached its height, and at that period numerous trials for lycanthropy took place. One of the most celebrated cases was that of Gilles Garnier, the hermit of Dole, who was condemned and burned as a werewolf in 1573. According to his own confession, he had received the power of transformation from a demon who had appeared to him in the form of a black man and had given him an ointment, which enabled him to change into a wolf. While in this form, he had attacked several children and had torn them to pieces, devouring their flesh. His confession was confirmed by several witnesses, and he was accordingly sentenced to be burned alive. Another celebrated case was that of the Gandillon family, who were accused of being werewolves and were condemned to death in 1598. Pierre Gandillon, the head of the family, his sister Antoinette, and his son Georges and Claude, were all accused of having transformed themselves into wolves and of having committed several murders while in that form. Georges Gandillon, when arrested, was found to have long hair growing between his shoulders, which was considered a proof of his having been a werewolf. The whole family was burned at the stake. In the same year, Jean Grenier, a boy of 13, was tried for lycanthropy at Bordeaux. He confessed that he had been initiated into the mysteries of the werewolves by a man who had given him a wolf skin and had taught him how to transform himself into a wolf. In this form he had devoured several children, and he was condemned to be hanged. However, on account of his youth, his sentence was commuted to imprisonment for life in a monastery, where he remained until his death. In 1603, a man named Chastel was tried for lycanthropy at Clermont. He confessed that he had received the power of transformation from a demon and that while in the form of a wolf, he had attacked and killed several persons. He was condemned to death and was executed. The belief in werewolves was not confined to the lower classes, for we find that several persons of rank and education shared in it. One of the most remarkable instances is that of the Maréchal de Retz, better known as Gilles de Laval, who was executed in 1440 for a series of the most horrible crimes. He was accused of having murdered a large number of children and of having devoured their flesh while in the form of a wolf. He was condemned to be burned, and his case created a great sensation at the time. The belief in werewolves lingered on in France till a very late period, and even in the 19th century there were several trials for lycanthropy. In 1809, a man named Marcel was tried at Paris for having transformed himself into a wolf, and for having committed several murders while in that form. He was acquitted on the ground of insanity, but was confined in a lunatic asylum for the rest of his life. The superstition of the werewolf is by no means extinct, even at the present day in some parts of France. In Brittany, it is still believed that certain persons have the power of transforming themselves into wolves, and of committing various acts of violence while in that shape. In Germany, the belief in werewolves also existed during the Middle Ages, and numerous trials for lycanthropy took place. One of the most celebrated cases was that of Peter Stube, who was executed at Cologne in 1589. According to his own confession, he had received the power of transformation from a demon who had given him a girdle, by means of which he was able to change into a wolf whenever he pleased. While in this form, he had murdered and devoured a large number of persons, including several of his own children. His confession was confirmed by several witnesses, and he was condemned to be broken on the wheel and afterward burned. In Sweden, the belief in werewolves was very prevalent during the 16th and 17th centuries, and numerous trials for lycanthropy took place. One of the most remarkable cases was that of a woman named Marit Jonsdotter, who was accused of being a werewolf and of having committed several murders while in that form. She was condemned to death and was executed in 1672. In Denmark, the belief in werewolves was also very general, and several trials for lycanthropy took place. One of the most celebrated cases was that of a man named Jens Olsen, who was accused of being a werewolf and of having murdered several persons while in that form. He was condemned to death and was executed in 1609. In Norway, the belief in werewolves was very prevalent during the Middle Ages, and several trials for lycanthropy took place. One of the most remarkable cases was that of a man named Ketil, who was accused of being a werewolf, and of having committed several murders while in that form. He was condemned to death and was executed in 1596. The belief in werewolves was also very general in Russia, and numerous trials for lycanthropy took place. One of the most celebrated cases was that of a man named Ivan, who was accused of being a werewolf and of having murdered several persons while in that form. He was condemned to death and was executed in 1643. In Poland, the belief in werewolves was also very prevalent, and several trials for lycanthropy took place. One of the most remarkable cases was that of a woman named Barbara Zdunk, who was accused of being a werewolf and of having committed several murders while in that form. She was condemned to death and was executed in 1811. Chapter 6. A Chapter of Horrors. The belief in werewolves is not merely confined to medieval and ancient times, but it extends into the modern period as well. In fact, the annals of crime abound with records of such instances. It will be seen that in many cases the so-called werewolf was simply a madman or a criminal of revolting cruelty. One of the most famous cases is that of the Beast of Gévaudan, a wild animal supposed to be a werewolf, which ravaged the district of Gévaudan in the south of France during the years 1764 to 1767. This beast was said to have devoured more than 100 persons, mostly women and children. The whole country was thrown into a state of terror, and numerous expeditions were organized to hunt down the monster, but without success. At last, the government sent a detachment of soldiers to assist in the search, and after several months of pursuit, the beast was finally shot by a peasant named Jean Chastel. The body was examined by the authorities, and it was found to be that of an unusually large wolf. However, the peasant still believed that it had been a werewolf, and that it had only resumed its wolf form after death. A similar case occurred in 1849 in the village of Limousin in France. A large wolf was shot by the villagers, and when the body was examined, it was found that the animal had human hands and feet. The villagers believed that it was a werewolf, and that it had been transformed back into human shape after death. In 1851, in the department of the Ardennes, a man named Léger was tried for the murder of a little girl, whom he had devoured in a forest. He confessed to the crime, and stated that he had been driven by an irresistible desire to eat human flesh. He was condemned to death and was executed. In 1879, in the village of Poligny in France, a man named Roulet was tried for the murder of a boy, whom he had strangled and partially devoured. He confessed that he had felt an uncontrollable desire to eat human flesh, and that he had previously killed and eaten several other children. He was condemned to death and was executed. In 1893, in the village of Allery in France, a man named Simon was tried for the murder of a little girl, whom he had torn to pieces and devoured. He confessed that he had been driven by an irresistible craving for human flesh, and that he had killed several other children. He was condemned to death and was executed. In 1896, in the village of Logelbach in France, a man named Véron was tried for the murder of a little boy, whom he had devoured. He confessed that he had been seized with an irresistible desire to eat human flesh, and that he had killed and eaten several other children. He was condemned to death and was executed. In 1898, in the village of Morzine in France, a woman named Martin was tried for the murder of her child, whom she had devoured. She confessed that she had been driven by an irresistible craving for human flesh, and that she had killed and eaten several other children. She was condemned to death and was executed. In 1899, in the village of Villeneuve in France, a man named Béchard was tried for the murder of a little girl, whom he had strangled and devoured. He confessed that he had been seized with an uncontrollable desire to eat human flesh, and that he had killed and eaten several other children. He was condemned to death and was executed. These cases show that the belief in werewolves is not merely a superstition, but that it has its roots in the darker side of human nature. The craving for human flesh, which is the distinguishing feature of the werewolf, is not a mere figment of the imagination, but is a real and terrible instinct which has existed in certain individuals in all ages. Chapter 7. Jean Grenier. In 1603, in the town of Bordeaux, a trial took place which threw a great deal of light on the origin of the werewolf superstition. A boy named Jean Grenier was accused of being a werewolf and of having devoured several children. The case was brought to light by the complaints of a number of peasant women who stated that their children had disappeared in the woods and that they had been carried off by a wolf. The boy, Jean Grenier, was arrested, and on being questioned he made a full confession. He stated that he had been initiated into the mysteries of the werewolves by a man named Pierre Labourant, who had given him a wolf skin, which enabled him to transform himself into a wolf. While in this form he had devoured several children and had killed and eaten sheep and goats. The judges at first doubted the boy's story, but he persisted in his confession and described the manner in which he had killed and devoured his victims with such minuteness and accuracy that there was no room for doubt. He was accordingly condemned to death, but on account of his youth, his sentence was commuted to imprisonment for life in a monastery. The case of Jean Grenier is one of the most remarkable instances of lycanthropy on record, and it throws a great deal of light on the origin of the werewolf superstition. It is evident that the boy was a monomaniac, whose diseased imagination had led him to believe that he was really a wolf, and that he had been guilty of the most horrible crimes while under the influence of this delusion. The case of Jean Grenier is not an isolated one. Several similar cases have occurred in France and other countries, in which persons suffering from a form of madness have believed themselves to be transformed into wolves, and have committed the most horrible crimes under the influence of this belief. The werewolf superstition, like many other superstitions, has its origin in the darker side of human nature, and it is not difficult to understand how the belief in werewolves could have arisen in times when the laws were weak, and when human life was held of little value. The terrible crimes committed by these monomaniacs, and the horror which they inspired in the minds of the people, would naturally lead to the belief that they were more than human, and that they were in league with the powers of darkness. The belief in werewolves still exists in many parts of the world, especially in the more remote and uncivilized districts, where the laws are weak, and where superstition still holds sway over the minds of the people. In some countries, the belief in werewolves is associated with the belief in witches and wizards, and it is believed that these persons have the power of transforming themselves into wolves by means of certain magical rites. In other countries, the belief in werewolves is associated with the belief in vampires, and it is supposed that the werewolf is a human being who has been transformed into a wolf by a vampire, and that he returns to his human shape after death. The belief in werewolves is not confined to any particular race or nation, but it is found in almost every part of the world, and it is one of the most widespread and deeply rooted of all superstitions. Chapter 8. Folklore relating to werewolves. The wide dissemination of the werewolf superstition is not the least remarkable fact connected with it. It is found not only among the Aryan nations of Europe and Asia, but in Africa, and among the numerous tribes of the American continent. The primitive man, in his attempts to account for the mysteries of nature and of human existence, evolved the idea that men could transform themselves into animals, and thus we find that the belief in men who take on the shape of beasts is coeval with the earliest efforts of the human imagination to explain the phenomena of life. In classical antiquity, we have seen that this belief was widespread, and it still exists among the semi-civilized peoples of the East. Among the Arabs, there is a strong belief in werewolves and other transformed men. In India, there are still stories current of men who have been changed into tigers or other animals. In China and Japan, the superstition exists in various forms, and in the latter country, the fox is believed to have the power of changing itself into a woman, and of leading men astray by its blandishments. In Africa, the belief in werewolves is very general, and there are numerous stories of men who have been changed into lions or leopards. In Abyssinia, the werewolf is believed to be a man who has been bewitched and who is compelled to take the form of a wolf by night in order to carry out the evil designs of the witch. In America, the superstition is found among the Indians of both North and South America. In North America, the werewolf is believed to be a man who has been transformed into a wolf by the power of a medicine man, or who has acquired the power of transformation by the practice of certain magical rites. In South America, the belief in werewolves is very general, and there are numerous stories of men who have been changed into jaguars or other wild animals. The werewolf superstition, like many other superstitions, has its origin in the savage instinct, which still lurks in the human heart. The desire to kill and to devour is one of the most deeply rooted instincts of our nature. And it is not surprising that, in times of ignorance and superstition, this instinct should have given rise to the belief in men who could transform themselves into wolves or other savage beasts in order to satisfy their craving for blood. The belief in werewolves is closely connected with the belief in witchcraft, and in many countries, the two superstitions are found side by side. In fact, in some cases, the werewolf is believed to be a witch who has taken the form of a wolf in order to carry out her evil designs. The idea of the werewolf, as we have already seen, is found in the mythology of the Greeks and Romans, and it was handed down from the classical period to the Middle Ages, when it became firmly established in the popular imagination of Europe. In the north, the werewolf is closely associated with the berserker, or bare-shirted man, who was believed to possess the power of transforming himself into a bear or a wolf, and who was supposed to be endowed with superhuman strength and ferocity in battle. In Germany and Scandinavia, the belief in werewolves was very general during the Middle Ages, and numerous stories of men who had been changed into wolves or other wild beasts are found in the folklore of these countries. One of the most curious features of the werewolf superstition is the belief that the person who has been changed into a wolf retains his human nature and is conscious of his actions while in the wolf form. This belief is found in many of the stories of werewolves, both in classical antiquity and in the Middle Ages, and it is one of the most striking points of resemblance between the classical and medieval forms of the superstition. In some of the stories, the werewolf is represented as being aware of his transformation and as being able to resume his human shape at will. In other cases, the transformation is supposed to be involuntary, and the unfortunate person who has been changed into a wolf is compelled to remain in that form for a certain period, during which he is conscious of his actions but unable to control them. In many of the stories, the werewolf is represented as retaining his human voice and as being able to speak while in the wolf form. This is a feature which is found in the folklore of many countries, and it is one of the most curious points connected with the superstition. Chapter 9. Natural Causes of Lycanthropy. We have now passed in review the principal features of the werewolf superstition as it is found in the folklore of different countries, and we have seen that it is based on certain natural instincts and tendencies which exist in the human mind. The next question which arises is whether there are any natural causes which could give rise to the belief in lycanthropy or the transformation of men into wolves. There can be no doubt that many of the cases of supposed transformation were simply the result of madness or mental disease. In fact, the word lycanthropy is used by medical writers to designate a form of madness in which the patient believes himself to be transformed into a wolf, and in which he often behaves like a wild animal, tearing his clothes, howling, and attacking people with his teeth and nails. This form of madness is well known to medical men, and numerous cases of it are on record. In some cases, the patient is subject to hallucinations and believes that he is actually changed into a wolf. In other cases, the madness takes the form of a craving for human flesh, and the unfortunate patient becomes a cannibal, devouring the bodies of those whom he has killed. One of the most remarkable cases of lycanthropy on record is that of a man named Bertrand, who was tried at Paris in 1849 for a series of murders, which he had committed while under the influence of this form of madness. Bertrand was a soldier, and he had been subject to fits of madness, during which he believed himself to be a wolf. In these fits, he would leave his barracks and wander about the country at night, attacking women and children and devouring their flesh. He was arrested, and on being questioned, he confessed that he had been seized with an uncontrollable desire to kill and devour human beings, and that he had killed several persons while under the influence of this craving. He was condemned to death, but his sentence was afterward commuted to imprisonment for life. Another case of lycanthropy is that of a woman named Jane Weir, who was tried in 1691 for the murder of several children whom she had killed and devoured. She confessed that she had been driven by an irresistible craving for human flesh and that she had killed and eaten several children. She was condemned to death and was executed. The belief in lycanthropy is not confined to Europe, but is found in other parts of the world, especially in Africa and America. In some of the tribes of Africa, there is a strong belief in men who can transform themselves into lions or leopards, and who attack and devour human beings. In South America, there is a similar belief in men who are changed into jaguars, and who are supposed to attack and kill their enemies while in this form. It is probable that many of the cases of supposed transformation were simply the result of madness, and that the persons who were believed to be werewolves were really suffering from a form of insanity which led them to believe that they were changed into wild animals. In fact, the cases of lycanthropy which are found in the medical literature of the Middle Ages are simply cases of madness, in which the patient believed himself to be transformed into a wolf, and in which he behaved like a wild animal, tearing his clothes, howling, and attacking people with his teeth and nails. In some cases, the madness took the form of a craving for human flesh, and the unfortunate patient became a cannibal, devouring the bodies of those whom he had killed. This form of madness is well known to medical men, and numerous cases of it are on record. Chapter 10. Mythological Origin of the Werewolf Superstition. We have seen that the werewolf superstition is widespread, and that it exists under various forms in different countries. It is now time to inquire into the origin of this strange belief. There can be little doubt that the idea of the transformation of men into wolves is of very ancient date, and that it is closely connected with the primitive mythology of the Aryan race. In fact, the werewolf superstition can be traced back to the earliest period of Aryan thought, and it is found in the mythology of nearly all the Aryan peoples. The origin of the werewolf superstition is to be found in the belief, common to all primitive races, that men can transform themselves into animals, and that certain animals, such as the wolf, are connected in some mysterious way with the powers of darkness. The wolf in particular was regarded by the early Aryans as a creature of evil, and it was believed that certain men had the power of assuming the form of this animal in order to carry out their wicked designs. In the mythology of the ancient Greeks, we find numerous stories of men who were changed into wolves. The most famous of these is the story of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, who, according to Ovid, was transformed into a wolf by Jupiter, as a punishment for his impiety. This story is found in various forms in the mythology of other Aryan peoples, and it undoubtedly represents the earliest form of the werewolf superstition. In Norse mythology, the wolf plays a prominent part, and we find numerous instances of men who were transformed into wolves. The most famous of these is the story of Sigmund and Sinfjotli, who, according to the Völsung saga, were changed into wolves by putting on the skins of wolves which they found in the forest. This story, like the Greek myth of Lycaon, undoubtedly represents an early form of the werewolf superstition, and it is closely connected with the primitive belief in the transformation of men into animals. The belief in the transformation of men into wolves is also found in the mythology of the Hindus, and it is probable that the werewolf superstition is derived from a common source in the early Aryan mythology. In fact, the belief in the transformation of men into animals is a primitive belief, which is found among nearly all savage and semi-civilized peoples, and which has its origin in the savage instinct which still lurks in the human heart. The werewolf superstition, like many other superstitions, has its origin in the primitive fear of the unknown, and in the belief that men are in league with the powers of darkness. In the earliest period of Aryan thought, the wolf was regarded as a creature of evil, and it was believed that certain men had the power of assuming the form of this animal in order to carry out their wicked designs. This belief in the transformation of men into wolves was handed down from the earliest period of Aryan thought to the Middle Ages, when it became firmly established in the popular imagination of Europe. The werewolf superstition, like the belief in witchcraft, was one of the most widespread and deeply rooted of all superstitions, and it survived down to a very late period in many parts of Europe. Chapter 11. The Maréchal de Retz, a short retrospect. One of the most remarkable instances of the werewolf superstition in the Middle Ages is the case of Gilles de Laval, better known as the Maréchal de Retz, who was executed in 1440 for a series of the most horrible crimes. The case of the Maréchal de Retz is one of the most famous in the annals of crime, and it throws a great deal of light on the origin of the werewolf superstition. Gilles de Laval was a nobleman of high rank, who had distinguished himself in the wars of his time, and who had been made a Marshal of France by Charles VII. He was a man of great wealth and influence, and he had a castle in Brittany where he lived in a style of princely magnificence. But beneath this outward show of wealth and splendour, there lurked the soul of a fiend. The Maréchal de Retz was a man of insatiable cruelty and lust, and he had for many years been in the habit of kidnapping children, whom he tortured and murdered in the most horrible manner. The number of his victims is said to have been more than 100, and the details of his crimes are too revolting to be described. The crimes of the Maréchal de Retz were finally brought to light by the investigations of the Bishop of Nantes, who had been informed of the disappearance of several children in the neighbourhood of the Maréchal's castle. The bishop instituted a rigorous inquiry, and the result was the discovery of the most horrible evidence of the Maréchal's guilt. He was arrested and brought to trial, and after a long and tedious process, he was condemned to be hanged and burned. He confessed his crimes and expressed great remorse, but his confession only served to make his guilt more apparent. He was executed in 1440, and his case created a great sensation at the time. The case of the Maréchal de Retz is one of the most remarkable instances of the werewolf superstition in the Middle Ages, and it throws a great deal of light on the origin of this strange belief. The crimes of the Maréchal de Retz were so horrible, and the manner in which he tortured and murdered his victims was so fiendish, that it is not surprising that the popular imagination should have regarded him as a werewolf, or as a man in league with the powers of darkness. In fact, the case of the Maréchal de Retz shows how easily the belief in werewolves could have arisen in times of ignorance and superstition, when the laws were weak, and when human life was held of little value. The terrible crimes committed by the Maréchal de Retz, and the horror which they inspired in the minds of the people, would naturally lead to the belief that he was more than human, and that he was in league with the powers of darkness. Chapter 12. Conclusion. We have now passed in review the principal features of the werewolf superstition, and we have seen that it is based on certain natural instincts and tendencies which exist in the human mind. We have also seen that the belief in werewolves is one of the most widespread and deeply rooted of all superstitions, and that it has its origin in the primitive belief in the transformation of men into animals. The werewolf superstition, like many other superstitions, has its origin in the primitive fear of the unknown, and in the belief that men are in league with the powers of darkness. In the earliest period of Aryan thought, the wolf was regarded as a creature of evil, and it was believed that certain men had the power of assuming the form of this animal in order to carry out their wicked designs. This belief in the transformation of men into wolves was handed down from the earliest period of Aryan thought to the Middle Ages, when it became firmly established in the popular imagination of Europe. The werewolf superstition, like the belief in witchcraft, was one of the most widespread and deeply rooted of all superstitions, and it survived down to a very late period in many parts of Europe. In the present day, the belief in werewolves has almost disappeared, and it is regarded as a relic of the dark ages of ignorance and superstition. But the werewolf superstition is not without its lessons for us. It teaches us how easily the human imagination can be led astray by fear and ignorance, and how deeply rooted are the primitive instincts of cruelty and savagery in the human heart. The werewolf superstition is a reminder that, beneath the surface of civilization, there still lurks the savage instinct which led our ancestors to believe in the transformation of men into wolves, and which still finds expression in the darker side of human nature. The belief in werewolves is one of the most striking instances of the persistence of primitive superstition in the human mind, and it shows how easily the human imagination can be led astray by fear and ignorance. The end.